Book 5, Salem. Safety Assured, Leaving East of Medicetti, Chapter 35. Stay far, far away from those trees. The soldiers on patrol the next evening squinted in surprise when they saw the man crawling out of the trees. "Help me, someone," he gasped. "Captain Thorne?" The two soldiers stared as the man struggled to get to his feet. "No food, no water." He collapsed against a bush. "Death." "Are you a garter?" one of the soldiers asked stupidly. "Of course not. I'm Lieutenant Offra," said the ragged man. "But how did you get up in there? What did you see?" The man, struggling to stand up, stared at them with empty eyes. "Neither of you," he said in a voice that chilled both of them to their bellies, "would ever sleep again if I told you. Now get me back to Fort Shin, and that's an order." Captain Thorne's mouth dropped open. "Offra's here," he whispered to the sergeant who gave him the news. He glanced at the door to the commandant's office to see it was still closed. "Where is he?" "Back treatment room of the surgeons," the sergeant whispered. "The surgeon agreed to keep this condition quiet." "And Raiden?" "Raiden? He went in too? Only Offra came out." "Let's go," Thorne whispered, and he and the sergeant silently trotted down the stairs, rushing through the compound and over to the surgeons. A minute later they burst into the surgery and marched to the private treatment room, ignoring the surgeon who hastened after them. Thorne swung open the door, eager to interrogate Offra, but stopped. Offra was filthy, bruised, and resting on a cot. Lemuel noticed the bloodstains on his torn clothing. The surgeon barreled in after Thorne. "Exactly what have you done to him, Captain? Why was he in the forest?" "I don't know," Thorne said in a stunned monotone. "That's why I'm here. You're relieved, surgeon." "He is my patient, and I will—" It was Captain Thorne's long knife that startled him into silence. It was pressing at his gut. "You are relieved, surgeon," Thorne repeated steadily. "And you will never reveal what you saw here, especially to Genève. Is that clear?" The surgeon licked his lips nervously, but the look in his eyes was defiant. "It's clear, Captain. It's clear. Nothing's ever going to be clear again." Before the surgeon stormed out of the room, he tossed an apologetic glance at the lieutenant, who, with great effort, was opening his eyes. Thorne spun to Offra. "Well?" he demanded as he slipped his long knife into his belt again. "Sir, the news isn't good," he whispered. "I found bones, horses, probably 4. Some other bones, too, far up by the boulder field, likely human, some very small ones, too. They didn't make it, Thorne. Here." He fished around in his trousers pocket and pulled out a strip of black cloth. "Found this among them, like the cloaks they wore. That may be blood dried on it." Gingerly, Thorne took the torn cloth and examined it, his eyes stinging. "Almost like teeth marks." "I saw bears up there," Offra murmured, "and wolves. Heard something like a mountain lion screaming one night. And other noises I couldn't figure out what caused them, like wailing. Terrible place, Captain. I'll never get over it." John whimpered, tears beginning to dribble out of his eyes. "I was sure I was next." "Where's Raiden?" Thorne seemed to regret asking. Offra's shoulders began to heave. "Slipped into a crevice. I didn't even hear him hit the bottom. A sudden cry and then nothing. The ground just gave way under him. Just emptiness, darkness. He's gone, sir." "When?" Thorne whispered. "Yesterday morning. We were still looking for remains, and then he was gone." Thorne nodded once. "So, did you find anything else? Any sign of Jatsi or a baby? Caves?" "I never saw any evidence of life in any caves we found." Offra rubbed his eyes and shook his head. It's been over a year, sir. There are bones scattered everywhere. Big ones, tiny ones. Could have been a baby. I don't know. I don't know. Nothing can survive in the forest, Captain, not for long. I barely made it out alive. Don't ever go back in there. Ever. The noises, the sounds. Not natural or normal. Thorn put down the cloth and awkwardly patted the trembling Afra on the shoulder. Well done, soldier, he managed. Not the news I was hoping for, but Afra was obviously upset. That he found something was really quite remarkable and unexpected, and disappointing. For a brief moment, he wondered if Afra might have been faking it. But his terror was real, and the cloth, which Lemuel picked up again, was very similar to the cloaks the Shins were wearing. Wolves could do that much damage. So could bears. Look, Lemuel, Afra said, his quiet voice struggling to be steady. I didn't go up there for you. I went hoping to find the Shins. Afra turned to stare in Lemuel's eyes, and the captain was taken aback by his intensity. Perhaps terror created clarity. I know you don't think much of me. I'm expendable, and that's why you sent me. And frankly, I hate you. But Lemuel, I wouldn't force even my worst enemy into that forest, and that includes you. I'm warning you now, and not as a friend by any means. Stay far, far away from those trees. Astonished, Lemuel could only nod back to Afra, who sighed and closed his eyes in an uneasy rest. Thorn squeezed his own eyes shut, trying to keep the wetness back, and held the torn cloth to his chest. So they were gone, completely gone. No more Perrin, no more Jatsi, no more hope. He couldn't pretend anymore. Thorn patted Afra's shoulder in as genial manner as he could. Rest up, soldier. Genevieve doesn't know you're here. And once you're up to it, I'll sneak you out again. Afra looked up at him with what seemed to be gratitude, as if his last warning and declaration of hatred had never been uttered. Indeed, something odd was going on in Afra's eyes as he said, Thanks, Captain. I could really use some sleep now. Understood, Thorn said, and once more something in Afra's demeanor seemed to shift. He almost appeared to be smiling as he wearily rolled over. Thorn made a mental note to tell the surgeon to watch for instability in Afra. Surely no man could come back from such an experience without some degree of madness. Lemuel stared at the cloth in his hand, shoved it into his jacket pocket, and left the treatment room. He was going to need another story, if only for himself, and a few more vials. Mari had been adequately warned by the scout who brought her the message, by Guide Gleese who visited with her for an hour last night, and even by Shem, who had returned in the morning and came to see her first instead of his wife. She knew the entire story. She knew where John had gone, and she knew how Perrin was dealing, or not dealing, with it all. Still, she was startled to see the depth of distress in his face when he finally came home on Clark that evening. He had stayed at the glacial fort until he received word from the scouts that John had been observed heading back to Fort Shin, carried by 2 soldiers who discovered him. Mari had been waiting on the front porch when she saw him coming down the road, his head low. He wouldn't meet her eyes after he dismounted, and started for the front door, so she blocked his way with a fierce embrace. Reluctantly, he wrapped his arms around her too, and once he held her, he didn't seem as if he would ever let go again. Only after a long time did he finally speak, his words muffled into her shoulder. Please tell me, honestly, have I destroyed your life too? Every single day, she said into his chest, has been a joy and an honor to share with you. He sighed into her neck, and she felt his tears leak down her back. You could be a scout. You lie as well as they do now. But thank you. Perrin didn't sleep well that night, nor did Mari. It wasn't her husband's tossing and turning that affected her, but the sullen darkness that came flooding back from Edge, where he had banished it a few years ago. By the morning, he was as red-eyed as her, and wordlessly they ate their breakfast. Pato had left yesterday with Lilla Travato and 100 other teenagers and leaders for Terrap's land, and Mari was grateful he wasn't around to see his father so low again. A knock came at the door, and Mari got up from the table. She intended to send whomever it was away, but she was startled instead to see Rector Bustani. "Good morning, Mrs. Shin," he said brightly, although it seemed to her that his eyes were puffy as well. "May I come in and speak to you in general, Shin?" "Oh dear," she murmured before saying, "Rector, I don't think you know what's happened." "I do," he assured her. "That's why I'm here." Mari surprised herself by whispering, "But he's so fragile right now." "I know," Bustani assured her. "I haven't come to knock him down, you know, only to brace him up." Of course," she said, still not wanting to let him in so that he could see the condition of Salem's general. But she couldn't think of a way to refuse him. Perrin was already in the gathering room, standing stiffly. "Rector?" Bustani smiled warmly. "General and Mrs. Shin, it's my honor to tell you that it's been over a year since you were baptized as members of Salem." Mari's heart flopped. They hadn't done too good a job at becoming Salemites. "And because of your efforts, you have been deemed worthy and ready to enter the temple." Perrin sagged and stumbled over to a sofa where he sat down and buried his face in his hands. "Obviously, you don't know what's happened." Bustani was over to him in a heartbeat, kneeling before him. "But I do, sir. Guide Glees called me and Rector Young to his home last night, and together we prayed to know how to help you. Then Glees sent us home to ponder what to do next. As soon as we had an answer, we were to visit him. Before sunrise, I was awoken with the answer. General Shin, only the Creator can help you, and he wants you in his temple. While you didn't intend to do anything wrong, you feel as if you've destroyed everything." Perrin stared at him with both surprise and hope. "Yes," he said, "I do." "He sees things differently, and he wants to soothe you. I rushed over to Glees's with my impression, only to find that the guide was already awake and waiting for me. He said he felt the same way, that you and Mrs. Shin needed to go to the temple, and he'd already sent a message to Rector Young to be ready to meet you there. Before I left the guides, Young had sent back word that he was hoping Glees was going to say that. So there's 3 of us, sir, who all got the same impression, that you are worthy and needing to go to the temple. Will you?" Perrin could only nod his head. Bustani smiled at Mari. "It's our custom that you bathe first, then come dressed in white clothing. White for baptisms, for marriages, for funerals, and for the temple. Every sacred moment calls for purity. Can you be ready in an hour? What you wore to your baptism will suffice. I'll drive you there myself, and Guide Glees said he hopes to be there as well." After he left, Mari and Perrin wept quietly on the sofa next to each other, before gently arguing who would bathe first. They were barely ready on time, spotless and white, and feeling rather self-conscious about it, when Bustani pulled up in the wagon. Soon they were on their way north into Salem. The site of the temple was remarkable in that the stone edifice, mimicking the ancient temple site before its ruin, sat on the easternmost edge of Salem. But what was astonishing to the Shins, since the first time they saw it, was a swath of land completely untouched in all the years Salemites had been there, bisecting Salem entirely, kept as pristine and pure as when Guide Pax first gazed upon it. A 12-mile-long and quarter-mile-wide section of potential farmland was left to remain as wild grasses and flowers. From the temple where it was perched, on a slight rise before the western mountains, all the way to the rise of the mountains in the west. Perhaps the most meaningful to Perrin and Mari was the approach from the south. One of the many rivers which meandered through Salem took a sharp turn near their temple and continued west, helping to divide Salem's southern and northern halves. Along the river grew a lush and dense forest of trees and brush. Another river meandered a quarter-mile to the north, creating the other border to the temple land, as they called it. But that border was populated with tall grasses, marshes, and occasionally moose. It was as Bustani's wagon neared the southern border that Mari fully took in the symbolism. They had to go through a forest to reach peace. Not that the forest was very wide. The wagon went through it and over the river in much less than a minute. But it was the idea and the irony that the world was terrified of the trees which could lead them to the safety they craved. "I kind of wished we could walk through the forest to the temple," she whispered to Perrin, "like the Zenuses told me they frequently do, to remember what their ancestors went through." "You mean what we went through a year ago?" "Next time," Perrin promised her. "Right now, I think Bustani is worried he might lose us if we walk." Mari instinctively held her breath as they emerged from the trees and turned onto the simple tracked lane which led to the temple, still a half-mile away. There was nothing else in front of them except for the meticulously carved white stone building, the mountains behind it, and the lush meadow full of wildflowers before it. They'd been here before, driving past on their way to a northerly destination, speculating about what the building contained. Now they were headed there, and Mari could take in the chiseled stone, the columns in 2 rows, the spanning roof, the 3 feet thick stone walls. A wide stone portico, open and inviting, ran the entire width of the temple. Below it on the ground were a variety of small boulders and jagged stone, leftovers from its creation, and reminiscent of the boulder fields their ancestors passed through to reach Salem. It was a good thing, Mari considered, that children weren't allowed. While beautiful, it wasn't the safest place for children to play. The grandmother in her wanted to construct a protective railing along the edge before the rock garden. But adults were careful, so no railing was needed before the rows of columns, rising as high as the ancient site. Supporting the roof above, the columns created an imposing yet friendly front porch, with even a few rocking chairs, painted white, of course, for those waiting for friends or family to join them. As they neared, the Shins saw that there were several people dressed in white waiting for them at the top of the stairs. Someone short got out of a rocking chair, and Mari immediately recognized Rector Young. She matched his soft smile, and noticed that Guide Glee stood there too, with an air of anticipation. Rector Bustani halted the horses, and Perrin helped Mari out of the wagon. Glees and Young came down the stairs to walk up with them. Neither Mari nor Perrin said anything, unsure of what was appropriate, so when Young whispered to them, "So happy to see you here," they knew that silence was the rule, and one of the reasons children weren't admitted. The gentle stillness of the temple put into Mari's mind a fluffy pillow, which was in odd contrast to the sharp and hard stone. However, even the stone seemed warm and inviting as they walked through the wide walnut wood doors with their escorts. Mari had never reached the point of speculating what was inside, but this wasn't what she expected. However, it was entirely appropriate. Before they'd left the world, she'd heard rumors about what temples in Terep's land were for. For some reason, every conjecture was full of violence, sacrifice, strange rituals. Why no one in the world could imagine temples were for peace, for love, for escape, she didn't know. She supposed the world simply preferred to believe their ancestors were necessarily debased and debauched. The idea that the current civilization wasn't the most sophisticated never occurred to them. They were always on an upward trend. The notion that their ancestors used to live better than them was unimaginable. As Mari looked around the vast and silent temple, she realized the imagination of the world was woefully inadequate. Before her was an immense space, immaculate and beautiful, and Mari realized she had just entered the Creator's gathering room. A few hundred people were there, seated among the many sofas and chairs, or talking in hushed tones along the walls, or near tables filled with floral arrangements. Only a handful glanced over to see who had come in, before going back to their muted discussions or silent ponderings. What surprised Mari the most were the trees. Yes, only Salemites would fill a temple with evergreens by the dozens, planted in massive pots, which, she later discovered, could be silently rolled on ball bearings to new locations. The 10-foot-high trees were used to create natural walls and quiet alcoves, and a sense of being outside while being inside. Many windows flooded the temple with sunlight, even some in the ceiling, pitched at various angles to channel the light and keep off the snows. Along the walls were curtains dyed in deep reds, an intense hue which Mari hadn't seen used anywhere else in Salem. The wooden chairs were elegantly and elaborately carved, in contrast to all of the simple chairs she'd seen in the valley. And woven intricately into the cloth covering the sofas was a design similar to the flowers and trees they'd passed. Hanging from the ceiling were elaborate wrought iron candelabras, which could be lit at night. Beneath her bare feet, they'd been instructed to leave their shoes at the entrance, were soft, warm rugs covering sections of the polished stone floor. Indeed, nothing in the world, not even the High General's mansion, was as fine and sumptuous as the temple. And here Mari had spent the last year thinking Salemites weren't capable of making something luxurious. They could, but they reserved it all to share with the Creator. Mari was surprised to see Mrs. Gleese in front of her. "Welcome," she whispered, "to the closest you can be to the Creator while on this sphere. Now, come sit and learn." And they did. And Mari understood why children weren't allowed, and why only those who truly wanted and needed to be there were admitted, because she began to learn how to listen, really listen, to the Creator, and how to speak, really speak, to Him. There was never a sound above a whisper, and she realized later that even the grand wooden doors were muffled, so as not to squeak or thud as they shut, and the rugs were thick to mute the sounds of footsteps. They sat there for hours after the Gleeses and Rector Young taught them, fully enveloped in a place that felt wholly otherworldly, wholly perfect, wholly safe. She didn't notice, as she thought deeply and fully, that others came and went, that Judith had been by, offered some prayers in their behalf, then went on her way again. Mari didn't even notice that midday meal time came and went because she was so fully wrapped in peace that she never wanted to leave it, as she poured out every last worry to the Creator, and had the sensation that He sat nearby, listening and responding to her every word. But eventually, her stomach growled, and Mrs. Gleese assured her they could return any time and stay for however long they wanted. The afternoon was already half gone when Mari finally looked around her to realize Gleese and Young had left some time ago, and new, happy faces dressed in white were there to assist and worship with them. Often Mari paused from her own thoughts and prayers and watched her husband. Some time ago, Perrin had positioned himself in an armchair of dark blue, which struck Mari as similar to the color of the uniforms he used to wear, but was intended to be reminiscent of the waters of the river nearby. He sat by a window of thick, wavy glass, which distorted the scenery outside, and 2 pines had been rolled over to give him some privacy. But what Mari worried about was that when his head wasn't bowed in prayer or thought, he was staring at the deep red curtains, which seemed to Mari arteries of blood. That color choice bothered her, and she wished the curtains were instead a delicate green like the rugs, or perhaps a cheery yellow, until she remembered something Guide Gleese told them as he pointed out the symbolism in the room. He must have noticed the shins glancing at the red curtains because he said, "Yes, they look like blood." That's not to put into mind violence or rage, but to recognize that even blood is cleansing, just like water. Blood is present in birth and quite frequently in death. But in ways that we do not yet understand, the Creator has revealed to us that blood can cleanse us, can free us from the mistakes and burdens and pains we carry. Someday we'll understand how and why, but for now He tells us to trust Him. The shedding of blood isn't always wrong, Perrin. Sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes it's even purifying. You're here to understand that for yourself. And that's what he was trying to do. Eventually, Mari stood up from her sofa, went to his side, and placed a hand on his shoulder. He turned his unfocused gaze from the window and smiled faintly at her. "They said you can come back," she whispered to him. "It's nearly dinner time." He blinked. "It is? I thought we'd been here only an hour." He went back the next day, without Mari, who had a house to maintain and a history text to write, but rode Clark and tethered him in the forest, where he enjoyed a quiet day of drinking from the river and nickering softly at passing Salemites. Perrin walked slowly, Mari found out later, along the river to the temple, relishing the metaphor. He didn't return again until dinner. The next day, he did the same thing, and again the next. Shem came over that evening, asking Mari how Perrin was doing. "He comes home quiet and pensive, but I think he's figuring things out," she told him. "He barely picks at his dinner, which is always a sign his mind is elsewhere. I get the impression he's on a very long walk, and when he reaches his destination, he'll let us know." "It's just that we've never known anyone to spend so long at the temple and every day," Shem explained. "Gleese is a little concerned about him. The volunteers there let him know what's going on, and they asked if they should try to feed him." Mari smiled at that. "It's just that you've never had someone with such a heavy burden to unpack. I think he's working through the details of many years and many lives lost. But he'll let us know when he's done, or when he's hungry." Perrin went again in the morning the next day, but came home earlier than usual. Mari noticed that as he walked from the barn, he had a slight smile on his face, and his step was lighter than she'd seen it in a long while. When he came into the door, he could see the question on her face. "It's good," he said. "It's all good. I think we can get a handle on living like Salemites. All we have to do is keep trying. We don't even have to succeed. Just keep trying. Perfection doesn't happen in this lifetime anyway. The Creator will fill in the parts we can't manage." "And Mari," he said to her joyful expression, "for some reason, I'm starving. Can dinner be early today?" She made him sandwiches, lots of them. It was as they were eating that he said, "I finished at the temple a while ago, but I made a stop on the way home." "Oh?" "I needed to talk to Professor Stone about ancient sites," he said offhandedly. "She didn't go with the big teen expedition?" "No," Perrin said. "She sent other archaeologists since she's too busy planning another expedition later in weeding season." Mari sensed there was something more to this, because Perrin was never good at being nonchalant. "To where?" she asked. "And why?" "It seems some of her senior students were approaching Terup's land last year and came across what they think may be undiscovered ruins." He tried to sound indifferent, but his eyes were dancing too much and giving him away. That's why Mari was bouncing on the edge of her seat. "And?" "Well, I've learned a lot over the past few days," he drawled, even though he never drawled. "And one thing is that the last day isn't coming tomorrow. I've been putting off some things needlessly, and now I understand that I have some time. It was made clear to me that there's one thing more important than securing Salem." Now Mari was thoroughly confused. "What could be more important?" "You. Professor Stone is putting together a team of students and archaeologists to try to find those ruins, and she said she'd be happy to take along some middle-aged assistants if you're interested." "Yes!" And that's the end of that chapter. Sorry if I scared you with that loud yes there.